Welcome to this week's episode of Information Return Intelligence, where we talk about all things 1099 related. And this week, we're going to talk about the $600 threshold again, which I know we've talked about several times over the last few weeks. But this is airing on Tuesday, the 27th. So our filing deadline is coming up for 1099 NEC. So we're down to the last go rounds with the $600 threshold. So I wanted to devote an episode to covering the history of the $600 threshold. We talk about it a lot. We've talked about how it's been around since 1954, but let's go into a little history lesson of the $600 threshold, which actually is going to take us through the history of 1099 reporting in general. There's an article on Substack that has more than what I'm going to say. It goes into more detail. In a podcast like this, if we go into too much detail, I suppose eyes start to glaze over a little. So check out the Substack article for more depth on this. So, the history of the $600 threshold. We know it's changing. The forms you're filing right now using a $600 threshold are the last ones. 2026 transactions, you're using a $2,000 threshold. So the threshold comes from Section 6041 of the tax code, which was written in 1954 and not indexed to inflation. We've talked about all of that before. But there's more to the history of this than just that. If we rewind the clock back to 1913, that's when our current tax system in the United States began, with a piece of legislation called the Underwood Tariff Act. Would you believe that that act was only 89 pages long in total, and the income tax portion was just 15 pages? That's 15 pages long. The other 74 pages were all about adjusted tariff rates and customs administration. The tax piece was very short, and it didn't say anything about information returns. But it wasn't long after that that we got information return reporting. In the War Revenue Act of 1917, so at that point, the United States was in World War I. The government needed more money. So the War Revenue Act did a lot of things to overhaul that early tax code. And this is where 1099 reporting was born, with a threshold of $800 and the familiar language saying that reportable items included rent, salaries, wages, compensation, remuneration, emoluments, or other fixed and determinable gains, profits, and income. That's still the language that's used, and it comes from 1917. And yes, an $800 threshold in 1917 was higher than the threshold that you're using now for your 2025 forms. Then we have to fast forward to 1939. Tax reform in 1939 gave us a $1,000 threshold for 1099 reporting. And then that got adjusted down several times throughout the 40s as the US got involved in World War II, but it even actually started before World War II. The article in Substack lays all of that out. It got as low as $500 in 1942 through 1947. 1948, the threshold was changed to $600. Now, why do we say then that the $600 threshold dates to 1954? Why don't we say 1948? Well, because the tax code was very different, it was laid out differently before 1954. 1954, there was major tax reform that rewrote the entire tax code. So that old code was laid out very differently. Our current concept of 1099 reporting comes from Section 6041 in 1954 with a $600 threshold. So that's the history of the $600 threshold, where it came from, and now it's going to $2,000 for 2026 transactions. Check out that article on Substack where we go into more detail on this. We give some inflation adjustment amounts. What was $1,000 in 1917? Or 800 in 1917, 1,000 in 1939, 600 in 1954. We have all of those numbers, the inflation adjustments, or what would that be worth now, out in that Substack article, and some more details about what the code looked like in those early days. Thanks so much for joining us. We do this every week, so join us again next week on Information Return Intelligence. And now, for those of you watching the video version of this podcast, a special treat with another cartoon episode. With another cartoon episode, a retirement party for the $600 threshold. When the cartoon piece is over, and it's only like 2 minutes or so, then I'll come back on with a wrap up about the $600 threshold, and then this week's episode will officially be over. Greetings, I am the ghost of Ward Hussey, and I am considered the father of modern-day Form 1099 reporting, including the $600 threshold, who we honor today for his well-earned retirement. When'll they have a retirement party for me? It is an honor to be here, just as it was my honor to be one of the key drafters of tax legislation in 1954, and to be involved in drafting tax legislation until my retirement in 1989. This is so legacy. That landmark legislation codified the $600 reporting threshold in Section 6041 of the Code. Later, in 1982, we introduced Section 6041 capital A, which separately called out contract labor. But through it all, the $600 threshold remained, a rock, a veritable force. Ward, baby, if you keep going, I'm gonna expire before I retire. I gotta say, it's been one heck of a run. 71 years of being the magic number. Folks have tried to get rid of me more times than a CP2100 letter chasing bad tids. Cringe. Well, I'm out of here. This is my town now. Don't be so sure about that, kid. So what did we learn in this little episode? The $600 threshold that we're all so familiar with has existed since 1954. In 1954, there was landmark tax reform. Ward Hussey was one of the people who was instrumental in writing that law. And that's where Section 6041 comes from, which gave us the $600 threshold, which was never indexed for inflation, which is why it stayed at $600 ever since. The $600 threshold actually is older than Elvis's first songs. He recorded his first song in July of 1954, and it wasn't until 1956 when he had hit records. So that's why we have like a Frank Sinatra type of character representing the $600 threshold. Now we have, or soon will have, a $2,000 threshold for 2026. But at the end of this scene, you notice there was this 1099K who came in, and Form 1099K takes precedent over 1099 NEC and 1099 miscellaneous, depending on how you pay. So we're changing to a $2,000 threshold, but in this digital age, using credit and debit cards, payment apps, and so forth, 1099K might actually apply. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll have another episode for you again real soon.